wonderful to be back here in Athy. It's just such a fantastic place and such fantastic people. I can't thank all of you enough. The support that we've had here, that I've had here for previous stuff on Franklin, makes me feel very good indeed. You have Shackleton, who never lost a man, and then you have Franklin, who lost everybody. On paper, it doesn't look good, but it's actually quite interesting, and I think our fascination and yours with Ernest have a strong overlap. I especially want to thank Frank and Seamus and Joe and Laura and all the other organisers whose hard work has made this event possible, and to them I say, Garamahagat. So a little bit of background, and then we'll be reading some excerpts from the letter. We were trying to think, people ask, when did you begin? And it's always a vexed question. When did we begin? Part of it began about 6 years or so ago in Greenwich at the Trafalgar Tavern, when I first met Mary Williamson. She had brought with her a black binder with all of the family archives, including, among other things, Sir John Franklin's hitherto unpublished final letter, 16 pages, to his wife Jane, and other letters from her to him. And when I saw that bound volume and realized that she had the originals of all those letters, I thought, well, this actually might not be a crazy idea. Because it was a crazy idea. There was nothing for it. And we started out back then, I think, with about 70 odd letters that we knew of. And as you'll see in the printed volume, we ended up with 195, which was many more than we expected. And so many moments here, I can recall, this is probably the last time I was here at the school when I was doing my Finding Franklin book and meeting with Gina, that's Regina Koner, our co-editor. And she was walking down the stairs over there, and she had some Crozier letters she had just gotten from the family. And she said, I'm not sure if it's this word or that. And I said, well, let me have a look at that. And then, of course, we spent all of the time we could in between talks in the stairwell looking at this thing and trying to decipher it. We're sorry that she can't be here with us because she's really the Crozier expert among us. But so over time, different archives opened up. We finished this book, of course, during the pandemic years, when almost everything had to be remote. But happily, in almost every case, archives and archivists were able to supply us with scans. And boy, we depended heavily on email. And then we would rotate the letters among ourselves, going over the especially difficult bits. As you'll see, Peter will share with you some of his sheets that he would send us with each of the words sort of cropped out of the manuscript and the question, what is this? And some of them are really quite astonishing. All sorts of handwriting, and in some of the writers, all sorts of spelling as well. So, that's the background of the story. We're going to begin by reading some excerpts from representative letters of some of the officers and crew who are in the book, give you a sense of the flavor of that. And then each of us are going to take a little bit of time just to talk about some of the bits that we particularly were drawn to or found particularly, what's the right word for, toothsome, particularly gnarly, particularly tough, which in the course of this kind of work was very satisfying when we were able to finally sort it out. So I'm going to pass the microphone now to Mary for the first letter.
This is an excerpt of a letter from John Franklin to Adam Turnbull, who was a friend and colleague of Franklin's from his time as Lieutenant Governor in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and it's dated the 19th of May, 1845. All the officers have been of my own selection in both ships, and they are a fine set of young men, active, zealous, and devoted to the service. Equally good are the crew, and many say that no ships could go to sea better appointed than we are. I trust also, my dear friend, that we shall all proceed on our voyage, not trusting in our own strength or judgment, but in the merciful guidance of the Almighty, with whom alone must rest the issue of it. Although Franklin says that the officers have been of his own selection, in fact we know that James Fitzjames, his second on Erebus, put forward quite a few names, and most of them ended up being taken on the ships.
Okay, this is James Fitzjames, and he's certainly certainly the most charismatic of all of Franklin's men. He wrote pages and pages. Some of it was previously published under the name of the Journal of James Fitzjames. It was a long serial letter to a member of his family. But we had to go back to the originals, and we found that when it was published, some of the bits were cropped out because they weren't too flattering to some of the officers. Anyway, I'll get on with this. So, inshallah, tonight or tomorrow morning early, we shall all be in Stromness, where we shall only remain long enough to see the transport filled with water and a few more bullocks. Don't think that we are late. We are in plenty of time. If the thing is to be done at all, it is to be done only between the 1st of August and September. I do hope and trust that if we get through, we shall land at Petropavlovsky, and that I may be allowed to come home through Siberia. I shall do all in my power to urge Sir John Franklin to let me go. There's a couple of points there. The bullocks from Stromness, the transport ship took some live animals which were to be slaughtered once they got to Greenland and used for the early food supply. Unfortunately, quite a lot of them had died on the voyage because up to Stromness because of the series of storms that they went through. Fitzjames's ambition to leave the ship and travel back through Siberia, it just partly shows his adventurousness. It's maybe a bit of a fantasy, but he had proposed to walk to the North Pole as well, before this expedition. He didn't have any Arctic experience, but he had a tremendous, driven force behind him to try these adventurous things. Over to you, Russell.
This is, of course, Francis Crozier of Banbridge in County Down. And, next to Franklin, certainly the most experienced commander, and had in fact already served aboard Terror as James Clark Ross's second. And, he was probably the least sanguine of anyone. I wouldn't say he was fatalistic, but he knew the risks. You'll remember that in the previous one, Fitzjames says we shan't be too late. And this is all the question of the timing of getting into Lancaster Sound, when the ice conditions would be favorable enough for them to get through. And of course, Crozier can think back to his voyage with William Edward Perry, where in fact they were too late. And when you are too late, there is ice already forming, your choices are constricted, and the odds of you getting through successfully are greatly diminished. So this is him writing to Ross as they are heading into the last stage of their voyage. All things are going well and quietly, but I fear we are sadly late. From what we can learn, the whalers here the winter here has been very severe with much easterly wind. There was, however, an early breakup of the ice, and the last account of whalers is that fish were plenty, and ships as high as the Women's Isles at 73 degrees. That's modern Upernavik. What I fear is that from our being so late, we shall have no time to look round and judge for ourselves, but blunder in the ice. And I will add to that because of circumstances beyond our control, there are many more letters from the officers of Erebus than those of Terror. They're quite few. So Crozier's letters, I think, take on an especially important role in painting a picture of that. And we're also quite lucky. You'll see later in the book there's an appendix. These are letters that were not known to survive as letters, but were published in the press. And one of those turned out to be very likely from his Lieutenant Hodgson, and describes the atmosphere aboard Terror as somewhat more somber. It's like Franklin's ship was clearly the party ship, and Crozier's was the think about things a lot ship. Not all of the junior officers were terribly happy about that state of affairs, although Hodgson did add that we have complete confidence in our captain and are sure that he will get us through.
This This is Lieutenant Henry Thomas Dundas Le Vicomte. He was second lieutenant on Erebus. The Le Vicomte family, they originally came from the Channel Islands, from Jersey, but by the time the ships had sailed, his father and sisters had already emigrated to Canada. And so his letters are actually held in the archives of Newfoundland and Labrador. He was engaged to Henrietta Lefauve, who was came from another Channel Islands family, and she never married. She died in 1868. Le Vicomte is described by James Fitzjames as being a shy man who improves, if anything, on closer acquaintance. And this is an excerpt from Le Vicomte to his mother. It's dated the 2nd of July off Disco in Baffin's Bay. My dear mother, I fear that were it not for the affectionate interest you take in everything relating to your children, you would find but little to please you in this letter. There is so little in the monotony of a sea voyage, and in the scenes of this wild and unhospitable land, which will pay for describing. But you will be glad to know that I am in very good health, and delighted with the proceedings of the expedition, that I am under the orders and guidance of a most skillful, amiable, and pious commander. All our proceedings are influenced by the greatest harmony and goodwill. Everyone is anxious to render a cheerful obedience to the wise regulations which emanate from our gallant captain. And Le Vicomte, he echoes the feelings, really, of all the letter writers. They all considered Franklin an amiable and a good commander. And they all just seem to have been delighted with him, which is contrary to how he's sometimes been portrayed in film and television.
Okay, this is Harry Goodser, who was the assistant surgeon on the Erebus, and he also had the role of naturalist. I've been busy for the last week with the animals to be found here, and all the other things which come under my department, so that my whole time has been taken up. I have got a complete vocabulary of the Eskimo language here, and I am only anxious to get casts of their heads and faces, which I hope to get all around the coast of America for the purpose of showing the differences. A few days ago, I went out with Sir John and the captain of the transport and landed on an iceberg and went to the very top. I suppose I'm the only one in the two ships that has been to the top of an iceberg yet, but I'm anxious to get a good knowledge of the structure of these immense bodies. Goodser's job was the naturalist. A lot of his time was taken up with a dredge pulling up marine life, which he would then draw under the microscope in the great cabin, Franklin's cabin. But he was also interested in geology and things like the structure of icebergs, so an illustration of that. The descriptions of him by Fitzjames and Franklin, they describe him as full of energy and always working at these tasks. And we have one page of his drawings of marine life, which came back with his letters and was published in a journal. But clearly we would have so much more, and if the expedition had got through and survived, then Goodser would be a really famous name in the history of science, I'm absolutely certain.
This is James Reid here of Aberdeen. He was one of two pilots that were brought aboard, ice pilots as they were called, both of them veterans of the Greenland whaling trade. There's interesting chat in the early letters about whether or not these ice masters are really needed. And even Reid himself, although because in the first part of the voyage there's no ice yet, so he says, well, I don't have anything to do yet. But he took to the role very, very ably. Since he had been to the Arctic many times before, he was relatively, calm about it and aware of the risks and wrote about them in a very level-headed way. And his letters are all to his wife, Anne, and addressing her and his youngest children, two sisters, They eventually emigrated to Australia, where the descendant of one of them, Rick Burrows, has become a friend of ours and helped out with the family background. So in some letter previous to this, which we were not able to locate, he must have asked his wife for a lock of her hair. And apparently Mrs. Reed did not send such a lock, and he wrote as follows in reply. Loving wife, I received yours of the 29th and 30th. Happy to hear that you and my dear young ones is well, as this leaves me the same. We are now underway. The steamboat is to tow both ships clear of the land. You mentioned that your old grey hair was not worth the sending to me. I can only tell you that your old grey hair is as good to me as ever, and I would have been very happy if you had enclosed one lock of it.
This is Edward Couch. He was mate on Erebus. He is described by James Fitzjames as a little bullet-headed, black-haired, smooth-faced lump of inanity. Good-humoured, however, in his own way. Writes, reads, works, draws, all quietly. Is never in the way of anybody, and always ready when wanted. But I can find no remarkable point in his character, except perhaps that he is, I should think, obstinate. And this is an excerpt from Edward to his parents. It's written the 4th to 11th of July, 1845, at Wellfish Islands, Disco. Old Franklin is an exceedingly good old chap. All are quite delighted with him, and very clever. He is quite a bishop. We have church, morning and evening on Sundays. The evening service in the cabin to allow the watch that could not attend in the forenoon to do so in the evening. He gives sermons out of his sermon books, and I can assure you adds a great deal himself. They say they would sooner hear him than half the parsons in England. He has 3 every day to dinner with him, and when the weather permits, the captain and officers of terror. He ordered stock and wine to be laid in, enough for 4 every day, and a cabinful twice a week for 3 years. So you see what a liberal old man he is. And this letter, this excerpt shows Franklin did give, sermons every day. He gathered, the men in his cabin, and he also, of course, invited Crozier over. Crozier wasn't quite so keen to come to dinner with Franklin. We learned that from the letters. Franklin was keen to try and take Crozier into his confidence, because he could see in one of the letters, the last letter that Franklin wrote to his wife, we see that he's concerned about Crozier being, not quite himself. And Franklin hopes that, he says, by and by, I hope that Crozier will feel more comfortable, come into my confidence.
Okay, this is the purser, Charles Osmer. And, okay, at the last moment, I have just that time to say, God bless you. The transport is now 4 miles out of the harbour, whilst I write these few lines. I shall get aboard the Erebus by 12 o'clock tonight. Then we have the latitude and longitude. This is to the west of Greenland, near to the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay. And it's dated the 12th of July, 1845. 296 icebergs in sight from the masthead. And then there's a little note at the end of the letter, in another hand. This was the very last letter from the ships. This is the final word when the sort of chapter closes. I think Osman was probably on the transport delivering the letters, and then he would have been rowed back to his ship. And so basically that's the end of voices actually from the expedition. The next part of the book is filled in with letters sent by the loved ones in the hope that they would reach their lost loved ones on the expedition. Wilson?
The observant among you will note that we are not sharing a daguerreotype of this individual. This skull actually was discovered back in 1992 by Barry Ranford and was preserved on site by the archaeologists then. It was retrieved about 2 years ago, and if you look closely there, you'll see a lone tooth. Teeth are much better for extracting DNA, and Doug Stanton, who's the land archaeologist up there, was able to get DNA from there, and he found his very first match with a living descendant, Jonathan Gregory, the great-great-great-grandson of Mr. John Gregory, and living in South Africa. So it's quite remarkable that in this case, it's the very first skeletal remains that have ever been identified by DNA. And as luck would have it, we have a letter from Mr. Gregory in our book. He was one of 2 railway engineers who were engaged by the Admiralty to oversee the engines which had come from railways and been put into the ships. He, like Mr. Reed, did not have a great deal to do in the early part of the expedition. In fact, they only carried enough coal to run the engines for a few weeks, but they only anticipated using them in cases where they absolutely positively needed motive power and the wind was absent or contrary. So there are actually some unkind remarks about the engineer of the Terror by Crozier. But anyway, so he was the father of a large family. Perhaps that assisted in the likelihood of one of his descendants still being extant. And this is the last bit of his letter to his wife and family. I hope, my dear, the children will all pay respect to my wishes with regard to their behavior as written in my last. Be sure you keep the children to school, both on Sunday as well as the week, and be careful of what acquaintances you make. I hope Fanny is improving in her business, and if you think it necessary, that she will get some lessons from someone more competent to improve her. I hope also James is giving every satisfaction, both with regard to his work and behavior. Give my kind love to Edward, Fanny, James, William, and kiss baby for me, and accept the same yourself. I remain yours ever, your ever affectionate husband, John Gregory.
Franklin is usually quite formal in his letter writing style. He's quite serious and factual normally, but we do see a very light-hearted side to him, specifically in the letters to James Clark Ross. And this is an excerpt from one of them, dated 31st of January 1845, so in the build-up to the expedition. My kind regards to Lady Ross, and pray say to her that if she makes up her mind to lend me the baby to go as your representative to the north, there shall be the nicest bed prepared for it that the best upholsterers can furnish. So it's a lovely image to have, and so totally different from the normal letters that John Franklin writes. Oh, it is the next one, right. And so, again, also a light-hearted note, again to James Ross, dated the 24th of February. I regretted not seeing you at Lord Northampton's. Was the treacle posset the cause? I hope not, for it would have been a proof that your cold, unlike mine, had not disappeared. The words treacle posset that you can see on the third line down, they look so obvious to me now, but we had real difficulty deciphering them. When the scan of the letter was sent to me, I think we had TRE and a few other letters, and my mind went off on a complete tangent, and I thought, oh, maybe this is something to do with the tremor that both James Ross and Francis Crozier developed in their hand and arm after a particularly harrowing incident in the Antarctic. And I was trying to find some sort of medical term that might have been used at the time to describe this tremor, which would fit with these two words. And I couldn't find it. And it came as quite a surprise when I found myself reading treacle posset. because it seemed so unexpected. But it did absolutely fit in with the following line about the colds, because treacle posset was a long-established remedy for colds, and in fact Russell found a recipe for treacle posset cold remedy in something like an 1822 recipe book. So that clinched it. And of course we know from the letters that although Franklin says his cold disappeared in this excerpt, we know that it came back because he suffered from a bout of influenza just before the ship sailed, and he ended up down in Brighton, which is on, if you don't know where it is, it's on the south coast, just along from Hastings, where Peter lives, and he was there to try to get rid of this flu in the sea area of Brighton. And Lord Northampton, who's mentioned in this excerpt, he was Spencer Joshua Alwyn Compton, 2nd Marquess of Northampton. He was president of the Royal Society, and it just so happens that we have an extraordinary line written about Lord Northampton by James Fitzjames. Again, just before the expedition sailed, he wrote this to his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Conyngham, on the 10th of May, 1845. On Thursday, I dined with Lord Haddington, the pleasantest party I recollect. After dinner, a little black, long-haired, short-sighted little goose hopped in, whom they announced as Lord Northampton.
We had James Fitzjames earlier on in this presentation. He was such a lively writer, and some of his letters he sort of peppered with little pen drawings, and this is one I'd like to share with you. It's the it's the stacks at Duncansby Head in the far north of Scotland, and I found the modern photograph of it, and I was blown away by what a very good likeness of it. And so, just from a very rapidly done sketch in the lines of a letter, that is a little bit of a clue to the sort of artistic nature of Fitzjames's personality. And there were too many to include really, but I thought I'd share that one with you. Moving on now, this is an example, and it's probably is the worst of the materials we dealt with. Some of the materials was very good. Some of it had been written quite clearly, but this one, all we had was this really poor photocopy. Particularly down at the bottom, and if I draw your attention to the right-hand margin there, you can see, this is the is it Captain of Marines, right? He's just continued up the right-hand margin when he's run out of paper at the bottom. So I recall that the final line of this, we assessed it as something about the ships are making up lost time, but there's quite a lot of square brackets which indicate a certain amount of guesswork, I would say. Russell mentioned some of the sort of techniques of sort of passing around the difficult sections. This is per Sir Osmer. It's not the original letters. All we have is some handwritten transcriptions, and in this the hand is so spidery, it's very difficult. This, in fact, I compressed it sideways by 50% because it was so stretched out. I could hardly get it on the screen at a reasonable resolution. But we hammered away at the difficult words, and I think we got them all in the end. Here's another one. I think this is assistant or carpenter's mate Wilson. Again, one of the not an officer, he was a petty officer, but essentially he was the lower ranks, but he had a skilled trade. Again, it's not a very clear scan, and one thing to notice, his spelling it deviates very much from the norm. So one of the problems we had when we did the first draft, we all had the instinct to correct spellings and write the sort of modern spellings, and then as it went through further drafts, we dragged it back to the idiosyncrasies of the writer. Not all of the texts were difficult to decipher. This letter I was very pleased that we found, it was due to making a late trip to the National Maritime Museum to just resolve a few problems. This is from one of James Fitzjames's very young relatives. And as you can see, it says, let me just put the pointer down, my glasses back on. My very dearest Fitzjames, I'm very sorry indeed to hear that you are going to leave England so soon. And she goes on to say, we hope that you will think of us when your toes are frozen in the ice and snow, and that when you come back to England you will come and stay with us for a long time. And that is a delight. There were 2 letters from young children, and it was an absolute delight to read them, and certainly they are the clearest handwriting of them all. Russell?
So now I'm going to tell the story of the letter that gave our book its title, and it has to do with John Hartnell. You can see here, this is a photograph of his grave that was actually taken, the original on the left, in the 1850s. The gravestones at Beachy were black, and they had white writing in incised letters. They were filled with white. On the right you can see how it looked when it was taken away for conservation, and scarcely anything of the inscription remained, and it gave the impression almost of being black writing on a white background. They now of course have replica boards there with a little bronze plaque with the inscription on it. He was one of 2 brothers. His older brother Thomas was also along. I'll mention of Thomas that he had been in the Navy for a couple of years previous. His service had been on a convict ship, HMS Tortoise, which, among its duties, transported a group of criminals to Van Diemen's Land, including my great-great-grandfather, William Brunt, also of County Down. Just a total coincidence, when I got his convict record, I said, the Tortoise, could it be? So who knows, perhaps they had a chat on the way over. So a long voyage in a ship called the Tortoise, well, what do you expect? But we knew in advance, of course, you're all familiar with the exhumation of the bodies at Beachy Island, and the work that was done then by Owen Beatty, and was written about by the book by him and John Geiger. And there was a photographer there who was actually a relative of the Hartnells. He was there in part because he could give permission for this particular exhumation. And he was also there because he, as a professional photographer, he wanted to be able to be sure things were done as well as they possibly could be. And here he is actually with a photograph of his ancestor. So I had not met this gentleman, but I did at the Death in the Ice exhibit in Ottawa. I was introduced to him and one of his daughters, and Mr. Spenceley. And I knew that he had read from the letter, and that there's an excerpt of it in the book, and it's in the documentary too, read from. But the only copy we could get was a Xerox copy at Scott Polar. Scott Polar has a very strict policy. If they don't have the original of the letter, they will not let you use it unless you get permission from the person who owns the original. And it turned out they didn't know who owned the original. So I thought, well, I'll talk to Brian Spenceley. Maybe he will know who owns the original. This was about a year and a half after I'd met him, and I had a hard time tracking him down. Karen Ryan, the curator at the Museum of History in Ottawa, put me onto one of his daughters. And I wrote to her and said, I'd like to speak with your father. Can you let me know his email or some way to reach him? And she said, oh, Dad doesn't use the internet. And I said, well, does he use the postal mail with him? Does he have a phone? Oh, yes, he has a telephone. He lives in a cabin in the woods, and he doesn't like modern technology or something. So I thought, okay, I'll just give this gentleman a call, and I did. He was a wonderful, irascible old fellow. He had a few complaints. He was not terribly happy about the COVID pandemic, and I said, well, why not? He said, well, it's not killing enough people. Oh, okay. I mean, he himself, I should say, was in the last months of dying from cancer, and was on palliative care. So he was a very strongly willed gentleman. And so I got round to the letter finally, and he said, oh yes, well that was actually passed down through the family of my brother Charles. Now Charles was the older brother of both the Hartnells who went with Franklin. He joined the army, which would seem to be a life-reducing thing, or at least a risk, but died at the hearty old age of 98 and had a very long family lineage. And Mr. Spenceley put me on to Charles's great-great-great-grandson, who turned out to be a professor of history at Oxford, at Merton College. Elizabethan history, unfortunately, but oh well. So I tracked this fellow down by his Oxford email address, and he wrote back and he said the letter had been in the care of his mother, who had actually just died a few months previous. And he said, oh, you know, I haven't really gone through Mum's things yet, but I'm pretty sure I know where it is. I'm pretty sure, okay. I wrote back cautiously a month later, a couple of months later. I thought, well, no, I hate to disturb someone who's going through his deceased parents' belongings. But eventually he wrote back and he said, I found it. And here it is. And here it is. This is the letter from which we took the title of our book. We knew long before we got the original letter, of course, that we wanted it. And so I was so very happy when I heard from this gentleman and he sent this scan. This is Sarah Hartnell, the mother of John and Thomas, and the conclusion of her letter to both of them. My dear children, if it is the Lord's will, may we be spared to meet on earth. If not, God grant we may all meet around his throne to praise him for all eternity, is the prayers of your affectionate mother, Sarah Hartnell. And that's that.
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Anybody? No?
Are there any letters from Sophie Craycroft to Crozier?
Not to Crozier, but we do have some of her letters. Jane and Sophie were pretty much inseparable at this point, and she sort of served as Jane's secretary, so occasionally wrote on her aunt's behalf. And so we have a number of letters from her, but none actually. The Crozier ones were outside of the bailiwick for our book because we started with the preparation for the expedition, and those would have been from earlier days. But she certainly has a very distinctive voice, and we have a number of her letters in the years.
So you mentioned a little bit about kind of discrepancies between maybe the actual men and their portrayal in the media. Because I'm just going on season 1 of The Terror, which you may have seen. I mean, you would know the gentleman a bit better than me, but what's your thoughts on their perception in that series?
Well, all very fine actors, and my view is that the people who wrote The Terror, they did incredible historical research. I actually worked with them on some of the background, and Matt Betts, who's the real expert on the ship, The Terror, worked with them. They did everything they could, but they were dealing with an adaptation of a novel, and they sort of inherited the characters from the novel, so the blustering imperialist Franklin, not to be seen in the pages of our book, but certainly a powerful performance. And then, of course, you have Jared Harris, a wonderful man. I like his portrayal of Crozier, although he is bound by the novel to start out with an addiction to the drink. There's very little evidence of that in any of his life documents, but it's not impossible. Or you might say how many people in the Navy were exposed to the drink. But there's no indication that he had a terrible alcoholic habit. But I do think that Jared really got the character right. I think he got that slightly doubtful, trying to convince Franklin that there was a real risk and that the risks were important. They should send, in the case of the series, men out to seek rescue sooner. And Franklin doesn't want to do this. And Jared Harris, I have to thank him. He actually was so kind as to come to my class at little old Rhode Island College and meet with my students and talk with them about the show. And I also had a class in Victorian literature at the same time. They came along, and he shook everyone's hand, posed for selfies. And I will mention another detail about him. You may know that Richard Harris raised his sons here in Ireland and sent them to Catholic boarding school, which certainly, it's sort of like being sent to Hogwarts, but in a different direction. It certainly had an influence on their character. And so as he was saying goodbye to my students and me, he shook us all by the hand and he said, "God bless you." Which I thought was a very endearing thing. He was a wonderful man. So I'm a big fan of the show. Not all of my co-editors are, but they certainly, as much as they could within the story they had, which I think they did very successfully, they tried to make it historically accurate. And I think that performance was an accurate one.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mary. Leave it there. Thanks very much. We're going to move swiftly on now to icebreakers. I'm going to hand over to Mark McLean, who is in charge. He is fully responsible for icebreakers. Just be clear about it at the very start. Mark is fully responsible for icebreakers all by himself.